Moderator's privilege just for a couple of minutes here. Delia, wow. So year two. Let's have a round of applause for Delia for organizing this. This has been your brainchild, and congratulations, and thanks to all the Berkeley people. Last year I was sitting here interviewing Ann Friedman. So how many people were here for that? Bunch? This is going to be even more interesting and entertaining. And maybe to plant a seed for next year, or for the cocktail hour after we're done, imagine what a trained and practicing physics PhD would paint now. Just a thought, and I'll show you some on my phone if you want to see them during the cocktail hour. Okay, so Adam Sterling started us off with a poem, and we have Jessica and Sharon here. Jessica is the person you don't want to get a call from, and Sharon is the person you don't want to have to call. And we're going to get this started by, I'm going to ask Jessica about the Philbrick case. She was one of the prosecutors on. But I want to read something in the spirit of Adam's poem, and we'll ask you who you think wrote this. And it's about the Philbrick case and the collateralization of reselling fractional shares in high-dollar contemporary art that we'll hear about in just one second. So imagine which word is coming next probabilistically. There's only about 50 of them. Unfortunately, his success was built on brazen lies, including concealed ownership interests, fake documents, and even an invented art collector. When the house of cards fell apart, Philbrick fled for a remote island in the Pacific, leaving many of his victims without recourse. For his extensive fraud, Philbrick is now sentenced to a substantial prison term, which was seven years, something like 7 years?
You're taking my punchline.
Okay.
Yes,
so who wrote this? How many people think this was ChatGPT? Do you know who wrote that?
I think it's a quote from the U.S. Attorney.
I think maybe you wrote it, or somebody in your office.
Somebody wrote it for the U.S. Attorney. Yes.
So it's actually from the press release in the case. So ChatGPT doesn't write everything, all right? So that's actually from the press release. So tell us about Philbrick.
Sure. So some of you, hopefully many of you, are familiar with this case, which is a fun one. I'll start at the beginning. So Inigo Philbrick was a young, up-and-coming, wildly successful art dealer. He was, I think, in his early 30s. He had an eponymous art gallery in London called Inigo Philbrick Limited. He was so successful, he opened an outpost in Miami. He was connected all over with the contemporary art market. That's really what he dealt in, was contemporary painters. He was sort of known as a market maker for certain artists like Christopher Wool and Rudolf Stingel. He was sort of an expert in those particular artists and dealt in them a lot. He was the protege of Jay Jopling, who started White Cube Gallery. And so, he was good looking. We'll just add to the schadenfreude here. A lot of, beautiful women, always on the arm, a very smart, well-spoken young man. And as his business progressed, he began to deal less and less in sales to collectors for putting on their walls, and more in working with people who were interested in investing. And the way it would often work is he would recommend to the various people that he knew were on his Rolodex a particular piece of art that he felt had good upside, and they would go in on the art with him. They would essentially agree to purchase a percentage of the artwork, usually in partnership with him. He would then, the idea was, market it and flip it for a profit. And often what would happen is there would be more than one person who would go on a deal with him. He also, to grow, so that became more and more of his business. He also decided to, in order to grow his business, start taking out loans. So he took out significant loan that was collateralized by his art. And you know, as part of that, this art financing firm, which was Sharon's client actually, they, you know, did a lot of diligence on him. They looked at, you know, he would present a piece to them to put in as collateral, and they would run it through the art loss register. They would take a look at the piece. They would have a condition report made, and Philbrick had to represent that he had title free and clear, because you obviously, you know, if you're a bank, you don't want to, you know, issue a mortgage on a house that somebody might have a claim to. Same thing goes for a work of art. Now, what happened, of course, is he began to do things like selling more than 100% of a work of art to multiple people.
This is the international fraud part of the panel, right?
Yes, you know, and often those people didn't, you know, they thought they were in partnership with Philbrick. Well, there were 3 other people in on that deal with them. And then he would take that piece of art and he would offer it as collateral to the art financing company, and not tell them that there were other individuals who had, they thought, a claim to the work. And, you know, I mean, a couple examples of this, just to spin out the story, you know, his probably the most expensive piece of art that he invested in was a 1982 Basquiat painting called Humidity. And he basically offered that painting to 2 different investors. And the way he did it was, he essentially said, I'm going to buy this artwork from this company. Here's the contract showing my purchase of it from, I think it was called SKH Management or something like that. You know, I bought it for $18 million. You can see it says that here on the contract. You know, you want to come in on it for 50% with me? And somebody said yes. Presented another contract to a different person. You want to, you know, pay 12.5% of this, a purchase price of $22 million from SKH Management. So they went in on it, and then he turned around and he offered it as collateral to the art financing company. Now, of course, it turns out that SKH Management was like a Pennsylvania supermarket chain, and the person who had signed on their behalf didn't exist, or they did exist, but it was a forged signature. And so as a result, you know, those 3 parties of interest got locked in civil litigation. So that's one example. You know, another example is there was a painting of a portrait of Picasso done by Rudolf Stingel that he sold percentage ownerships in to, I think, 3 different parties. He then turned around and had Christie's auction it off. One of those 3 parties, one of the 3 investors, was actually the person that had the consignment agreement with Christie's. And then he convinced the other 2 who didn't know about the other 2 investors that they were the consigners. And then when the hammer fell and the price was not nearly as high as he had predicted that it would be, then he had some real problems. So in the fall of 2019, what happened is he basically stopped being able to pay people back. I mean, it was a pseudo Ponzi scheme, and he would take the money from one victim and use it to pay the next. And he started to get in trouble with people who began saying, "Where's my art? Where's my money?" And he then, in like fall of 2019, disappeared, shut down his London gallery, shut down his Miami gallery, booked a ticket on an airplane to Australia, and disappeared. Leaving a whole host of civil lawsuits behind him, which is sort of where I and my office come into the picture. You know, Sharon was one of the first in the door on behalf of her client, and you know, we took about 9 months basically putting together what had happened, getting email search warrants, talking to galleries, subpoenaing people to come tell us their side of the story, and you know, it was very difficult to put together because of the complexity of the deals he had put together. And we eventually traced him to Vanuatu, which is an island pretty far off the coast of Australia, that does not have an extradition treaty with the United States, but they're friendly. And this was the middle of the pandemic. As Sharon reminded me, it was May 2020. And we convinced the State Department to swoop in with an airplane and pick him up, and we I think he was presented in like the Marshall Islands or something like that before a judge, and wound up in New York. And the punchline is that he got a 7-year, very significant sentence for an $86 million fraud. So that's Mr. Philbrick.
Sorry to spoil your punchline.
That's okay.
Thank you. That's such a fantastic telling of the story. And there are many issues there that we're going to talk about in just a second. But Sharon, give us your perspective on Philbrick.
Well, I mean, that was a really phenomenal case, and incredible work by the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI. I have to say, for my client, who was, I mean, it was horrible for them. They had loans out on the artwork, and one of the things is, you think if you have possession of something, then you're protected. The difference between art and, say, real estate or other property is there is no real ability to file like liens against the artwork. I mean, they did actually get a UCC lien. They did everything they were supposed to do. They did the art loss register checks, etc., and it looked clean. They saw the contract. They saw where it was purchased. They actually did due diligence and checked with the actual buyer to confirm that it was sold. He was smart enough that he told pieces of the truth to some people. So my client, who had like an extensive due diligence process, was able to confirm all those things. But what wasn't visible was the sale of the fractional interest to the other people. But my client, because they're a lender, they take possession of it. They have the piece. So how could they not have the claim? They think that it's all secure, and then, you know, everything sort of falls apart. But this case sort of highlights, just with respect to art, how the nature of the asset itself can lend itself to being abused. Obviously, there's lots of reputable dealers and galleries and auction houses that would never engage in criminal activity, but for those that do, there are a lot of the sort of tripwires that would allow you to be detected sooner are often don't happen so quickly in art. Also, the other thing that I see over and over again is when you're dealing with high net worth individuals, they oftentimes have slightly different motivations. Like, one of the things, and what I was thinking as Jessica was talking about it, because I've had several clients come to me who, it's not the scale that it's a fraud, but they feel like they've been cheated by the dealer. They know that like there's a lot of like sort of shenanigans that are going on, misrepresentations about prices, and sometimes outright they think they've been defrauded, but don't actually want to do anything or report anything, because big name collectors and big name dealers have access to the artists and have access to the collections. So somebody that's really involved in the art world, they don't want that access cut off. They don't want to be, to sever their relationship with that particular dealer. So they'll tolerate a little bit of like, I know they're not being right to me, but as long as I, have the inside track on things, it will. But when I started really looking into it, when I went into private practice, I was really surprised at how it's like the Wild West. You could never do it in any other industry.
Yeah, I think that this case really highlights sort of the new reality of the art market versus the old customs of the art market that are very ingrained, including secrecy and opacity and privacy, legitimate privacy concerns on behalf of wealthy people who, it was very challenging even to get victims to talk to us in this case, because there is such a custom around, people didn't really want to be associated with it because they were embarrassed, but they're far from the only people who, do deals based on essentially handshakes and like unlawyered contracts in the art world. I mean, a little bit of diligence, for example, in the SKH management Basquiat example would have gone a long way. So, there's that tradition in the art market. And then that runs into these new practices of fractionalization of art as a collateral, art as an asset, where it opens it up for a whole new world and sort of magnifies the potential for fraud and when you don't actually have the piece.
So can we dig into some of the reasons behind that? I'm a person who studies financial innovation. One of the things that I think people find so valuable about this conference is thinking through the intersection of art, finance, and law. So talk to us specifically about what it is that's problematic in the fractionalization. We have lots of other areas of the financial markets where we have fractionalization. Sometimes we have problems, sometimes we don't. So talk us through what, in Philbrick or more generally, is problematic about this fractionalization that's new and is creating some of these difficulties. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yes, but this is the kind of thing that I probably, particularly in this environment, shouldn't be admitting that I think it's a problem.
Those cameras are not on right now. I think you'll be fine.
The lack of regulation. Like in every other financial asset, there's a tremendous amount of regulation. I mean, if you look at digital assets, people might say there's too many people chomping at the bit to regulate those assets. But here, with respect to art, there is no regulator. Unlike the EU, the UK, the US doesn't have any anti-money laundering obligations that are imposed on auction houses or dealers. Most auction houses will have their own, or all the major ones have voluntary anti-money laundering programs that really model what a financial institution has, but they're voluntary. They don't have to do it. There's no requirement that they know who the seller is, who the buyer is. There's no registry or record. So it becomes those areas without that type of regulation. It makes it easier for these type of frauds to pop up. I worked on a case where it was an investigation that ended up sort of not ending up in any type of prosecution, but it was one where it was misrepresentations from my client was the seller, but misrepresentations from the seller to the buyer. The buyer was outraged over it. There was an ensuing sort of worldwide investigation, but you could see in that space there really was no law except for like criminal laws like wire fraud. There was no laws that say that there has to be some level of honesty in terms of what you're dealing with, that in terms of the negotiation process, it tolerates a lot of misrepresentations or essentially fibbing around that process. So in that, it's a real gray area of what can be done. Whereas for most other significant financial assets, there are significant rules that have to be complied with, and there are regulators that are examining the company to make sure that they're acting in compliance.
Any thoughts about whether, I mean, obviously we do have regulation ex post, right after the fact we have prosecutions, we just don't really have a regulatory regime. Does that end up affecting you? You still have statutory authority to bring these fraud cases under wire fraud or other statutes, right?
That's right. I mean, when you think about the Bank Secrecy Act, for example, which is the act that requires financial institutions to have anti-money laundering, know your customer regimes, to have a compliance function, and to actually make what they call suspicious activity reports to Treasury about things that they see that might be problematic. Those reports are only ever seen by law enforcement, but it's a trove of information for when you're hearing something and you want to go check it out. And then banks, when they see something that's problematic, they typically will shut down an account, for an example. You don't see that kind of cataloging of problems in the art market. You don't see that sort of the reporting, although now I think as was noted before in the prior panel, or maybe it was the panel before that, antiquities dealers are going to be considered financial institutions, so that'll be interesting. I don't know whether they're going to have SAR reporting requirements. I think we'll see. But so essentially, there is no, yes, in a way it makes my job harder is what I would say. If I were a dealer or a gallery, right now you need to know who you're dealing with. I mean, that's like a really central function. Who is the ultimate beneficial owner? Most of the time, frequently I think in the art market, you're dealing with intermediaries. You're dealing with interior designers or art advisors or agents who are acting on behalf of people, wealthy people who are acting through shell companies or trusts and the like. That's ordinary. A lot of the red flags that would pop up for a bank, for example, they might flag all of that as suspicious activity. It's ordinary in the art market, but the reality is, I think, There's risk, particularly now with sanctions regimes. You have to know who you're dealing with, and if somebody is not willing to tell you, I would be concerned.
You both also have a lot of international expertise and have to. And Philbrook is an example of that. Could you talk a little bit about, maybe starting with you, Jessica, sort of what are the international dimensions that ended up mattering in that case and that you end up confronting, and then same for you, Sharon?
Yeah, so I mean, it was a very typical of the art world kind of case. You know, he was based in London and Miami. His clients were all over the world. You know, the art financer was in New York. Many of the people who were ripped off were in Europe and in London. He had storage facilities in Switzerland and the United States. He had shell companies on the Isle of Jersey. So, you know, it makes prosecuting and investigating difficult. I mean, that's the reality with cross-border crime. It makes it hard to investigate it, and the smartest criminals take advantage of that. I don't think Philbrook was purposefully taking advantage of it. That was a business proposition for him. But, you know, you do what you typically, I mean, we have good relationships with, you know, the FBI art crime team that I was working with has good relationships with the Metropolitan Police, so there's a lot of law enforcement to law enforcement talking. You submit, you know, mutual legal assistance treaty requests that nations have to between each other to, you know, enable the law enforcement of one country to get access to witnesses and documents in another. So we did that with Jersey, we did that with Germany. You know, so you do your best, but some things are just kind of, you know, one of the biggest victims in the case would not talk to us. They were in the UK. We had no way to force them to. They're not under our grand jury jurisdiction. And so that was, you know, couldn't talk to that person. That was just the reality.
And Sharon, is this making you nostalgic, feeling, remembering all these issues, or do you get plenty of them at Sullivan and Cromwell?
I do get a bunch of them, particularly because we do have clients that are located all over. I just have a matter right now where it's like, oh, it concerned an auction that took place in Hong Kong. The contract is under UK law. They're all US persons. They're desperate to apply New York law. I keep trying to explain to the client, we can't, New York law doesn't apply here. But so there definitely is, particularly for high net worth individuals that are, and companies that are involved in the art space, it's generally, you know, going to be pretty international. But you did say I could tell war stories, so I just have one story to say, which is just shows sort of the nature of what art is like and how easy it can be for actually money laundering the, you know, this is the other aspect we hadn't really touched on yet, which is taking crime proceeds and turning it into art so that it can be moved all over. So, and by the way, they called me out, some reporter called me out and complained that I use this case all the time as an example of money laundering through art, and is that the only example I have? But it is the best example. So there was this massive bank fraud in Brazil where the head of a huge bank in Brazil embezzled what seemed like a lot of money back like 15 years ago, $200 million. Now with the $1 billion frauds, it looks like a tame little fraud. But what he did with the money that he stole is he turned it into this amazing art collection, including a Basquiat. And he set it up in the name of all different shell companies. He ended up getting arrested. He got convicted in Brazil. And he ends up, when they go in, the Brazilian authorities go in to seize his art collection, which is worth like over $200 million, totally gone. And they've been moved all over the world. And one of the more expensive pieces was a Basquiat Hannibal. And so when it actually came into the United States, and when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, we seized it. But when it came in, it had been removed from its frame. It was very large, but it was removed from its frame, and it was listed on the customs importation document as a painting by an unknown artist worth less than $100. And if you look at the painting and you see a Homeland Security, a border control officer looking at this, they would not think it was bought for $8 million. No one would think this was worth $8 million. So it just shows how easily things can move back and forth. And ultimately, this was a case worked on for years. Pieces showed up all over the world and ultimately came back to go back to Brazil. But it's just, that is how easy across the border you can move art.
This is great. War stories are very welcome for the next 25 minutes. You raise another point, which is, I think, true of Philbrook and also more generally, which is this question of valuation. So could both of you just talk a little bit about valuation? It is so different from other asset classes, right? And it creates all kinds of puzzles and conundra, so valuation.
Sure. So valuation, I mean, we can go to the Basquiat example from the Philbrook case, right? He purchased that painting for actually, in reality, in a private sale at Phillips Auction House for $12 million. Turned around, made some fake contracts. He didn't really, you didn't need to do that, I don't think. A lot of people just misrepresent how much they bought it for. But, he said, I bought it for $18 million, I bought it for $22 million, and the investors were willing to believe that. I mean, when it comes to valuation, it's sort of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, value is in the eye of the buyer. What you're willing to pay. And so it is difficult, possibly impossible, to bring a fraud charge based only on misrepresentations of value. The thing that he did that was really fraudulent there was forging someone's signature and representing that there was actually an arm's length transaction that had sort of been inserted into the middle. He did that a lot. He did, he would pass artworks through shell companies that were essentially controlled by him and his girlfriend at the time, and then say, well, you can pretend as if that was an intermediary transaction that increased the value of the artwork, so that people got duped that way. But the fact that valuation also makes art a good tool for money laundering, because you can kind of pretend it's worth whatever you think somebody will be willing to pay, and that makes it a good vehicle for basically pumping illegal proceeds into.
You're nodding. I imagine you have valuation questions every day. By the way, it was amazing that you're able to. We really appreciate you. I know you had an incredibly busy day, and so I was very nervous that we weren't going to have Sharon. So
sorry.
Yeah, no.
I didn't mean to stress you out.
I was nervous too.
Yeah, but valuation is something you're probably on 5 calls today thinking about these issues. So tell us about your.
Yeah, I mean, it always is. It makes it, because of the value of art can be so can change, and frankly, there oftentimes are a handful of people that really know the market and know what it is. So if someone in that world is taking positions on it, then it has you have to rely upon that. So you could see one of the cases I was involved with was the Dmitry Rybolovlev, Yves Bouvier. There was a lovely story in the New Yorker about it, but it was a Swiss dealer, collector that was dealing with a Russian oligarch, an unsanctioned Russian oligarch, and he was helping him to buy art, and he was charging him more than what the Swiss dealer was charging, more than the Russian oligarch expected to be charged. Didn't realize, thought he was just giving it to one shell company to another shell company, thought he was charging him essentially the price that Yves was buying it for. Turned out he was substantially increasing the price. This was discovered, lots of litigation all over the world, injunctions, etc. But one of the pieces was that Leonardo da Vinci Salvator Mundi, and I believe there's a documentary about this. But the view was, when it was put up for sale at Christie's, and I went over to Christie's like everyone else to go look at it. And when it went up for sale at Christie's, it was being offered for about $100 million, which was substantially less than what Dmitry Rybolovlev bought it for. And then lo and behold, the auction takes place. And remember, authorities are looking at this to see if this is a fraudulent transaction, where Rybolovlev was defrauded of about $50 million. So the auction takes place. Everyone expects it to sell for around $100 million, and it sells for $450 million. accounts. So it's hard to really be able to prove, for the government to be able to prove a fraud case in that circumstance where the victim only made, $300 million on the transaction, doesn't have a lot of jury appeal. So, that's the thing about art. It's very different than any other kind of asset.
You both have talked about shell companies, and when we think that term, we think of it as being disparaging, but let me just try to stick up for shell companies for a little. There's some rich people here. How many people like using shell companies? Come on, we like that, but there are real privacy concerns. So you have clients who I'm sure have serious privacy concerns, so talk us through that.
Yeah, I think that particularly in like New York City, you are going to find, I, of course, foolishly own my home in my own name. But I think that if you look at most, like real estate, higher end real estate than mine, but real estate in New York, it's never owned in somebody's name. It's owned in the name of the corporation with that address. Everybody owns things that way for privacy purposes, for a whole host of legitimate reasons. The problem is that, particularly if there's shell companies that are set up, and oftentimes they're shell companies within shell companies within shell companies, law enforcement can ultimately get that information, but it takes a long time. So while it provides some level of privacy, it generally can help to obscure, particularly in situations where funds are being moved and time is of the essence, being able to use them and not having the ability for law enforcement, not just the general public, but for law enforcement to be able to identify it, it enables the time that's available to be able to, move the asset, move the money, commit the fraud.
So the Corporate Transparency Act, Sharon, I think you're probably familiar with this, but it's in January 2024, U.S. LLCs and corporate entities that are formed in the U.S. or that are foreign and are registered to do business here are going to have to start, I think, reporting their beneficial ownership to the Treasury. So that is going to be a big change here in the U.S. Government, anyway, is going to know who the UBO is of a lot of different entities that are operating here.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges in that being put together, but
Yes.
It's funny. So they had all these leaks, like the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, et cetera. But in one of the leaks, it was discovered, it was always thought like, oh, these Caribbean, these, Cayman Island trusts, these BVI trusts. Turns out the U.S. has like a tremendous number of them. Wyoming, Delaware.
North Dakota, yeah.
We just had a fantastic panel that we listened to about provenance and a whole range of very challenging questions. Tell us about Portrait of Wally.
So this will always be, my heart, the greatest case I ever worked on. I worked on it when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and it was very similar to the matter that you heard about with respect to, some of the issues with provenance for Nazi stolen art. But Portrait of Wally was a painting by Egon Schiele that had belonged to an Austrian Jewish woman, Leah Bondi-Jarret, and it was taken from her. Her gallery was Aryanized by a Nazi. She was able to get out of the country and to be able to go to London. But on the eve of, literally the night before she was leaving, the Nazi who Aryanized her gallery, Friedrich Welz, came to her home, saw the portrait, it was a portrait of a woman's face, hanging on the wall, and he demanded it from her. And she had no choice but to turn it over to him, and she never got it back. She tried for the rest of her life to get it back. It ended up being acquired after he met with her, Rudolf Leopold, who ended up setting up the Leopold Museum in Vienna, a very beautiful museum, all from his collection. But he had spoken to her, he offered to help her get it back, and then he took it for himself. And she tried for the rest of her life to get it back. Next to her bed, after she died, her family found a letter telling the story of it. We had the most incredible evidence in this case. We had all these handwritten letters she had written to him, including her little deathbed letter talking about what happened. So her family, they thought it was lost. They could never get it back. And then in 1997, there was an exhibition at MoMA. and Portrait of Wally came to the United States, and Leah Bondi Duray had multiple heirs. That she had no children, but she was very close to some of her nephews and nieces, and one of them lived in New Jersey and came to the government, and it seemed crazy at the time. We got a seizure warrant for that, and there were editorials written about how dare the U.S. government do this, that museums decide these questions, not the government. I mean, it's so funny because the whole view of this has so completely changed now, but back in '97, this was seen as like crazy. How could you possibly do that? But with the case was dismissed at one point. We were able to get it reversed. It went up on appeal, all different types of things. It went on for 13 years. And then finally, Rudolph Leopold passed away. On the eve of, there was one tiny issue that was going to be tried. We'd won on everything else. And the one tiny issue, they offered to buy the painting from, the Leopold Museum offered to buy the painting from the family for $19 million, which was a little bit above market price, though it was only worth about $1 million when the case started. So they should have offered that up a lot sooner. It would have saved a lot of money. And so we settled it, and then we had, like this amazing, repatriation ceremony. There's a plaque, if you ever go to the Leopold Museum in Vienna, there is a plaque next to the painting that tells the story of how it was taken from Leah Bondi Duray, and most importantly, it tells the story, from my perspective, the civil forfeiture action. It is the only time you are ever going to see at a museum the words civil forfeiture. I even included in there, because I got to write the plaque, I even included like the theories of forfeiture. It was a little overdone, but it's there. So, but the case, because of sort of a lot of really great reporting on the case, it really brought the world's attention to the fact that when these paintings were taken during the Holocaust, a lot of people never got back their stuff. It was a different environment post-war, and so Austria's archive was sealed, so no one could see what happened. And of embarrassment of it, these countries started opening up their archives. Researchers went in. One of the people that ended up getting their art back from that was Maria Altman, the woman in gold, that Helen Mirren movie. What happened was researchers went in and discovered that Adele Bloch-Bauer, the real story of what happened with Adele Bloch-Bauer, so her family, Maria Altman, her niece, was able to recover that painting. So that kind of really sort of opened, the floodgates to that and changed the whole environment. Now, if you have a painting that has a missing gap in provenance during that time period, no one will sell it. No reputable auction house would sell that thing. And instead, what I do a lot of now is I do what they call Washington Principal settlements, which is I have a client that's located in a jurisdiction where they 100% have ownership of it. If the case were litigated, they would win. No chance that they wouldn't win. However, they would not be able to sell it. It's just unmarketable. No one's going to do it. So what my client will do is I will reach out to the family and offer to do a Washington Principal settlement, where typically depending upon the circumstances, there'll be typically a split in the price of the art when it's sold. Or I've had cases where my client has paid money to the family. So, that's something that is seen as very unusual for most other commodities. Someone wouldn't, if something was stolen, but you're a good faith purchaser that paid good money for it, you're going to give some money to a victim like 7, levels down the chain. But that's what happens with Holocaust property now.
I know you can't talk about future cases or things that you can't talk about, but can you just reflect on these issues as a prosecutor now and thinking about looted art, cultural heritage property, and this whole set of challenges? I wrote down a quote from the last panel: "We rarely feel confident." Tell us kind of what your thinking is as a prosecutor about this complex set of problems.
Well, it's interesting, the work in the Holocaust era art that was really, Sharon was instrumental in sort of starting that whole field, essentially, has now changed into a much broader field where, of course, now places like Cambodia, for example, are demanding their art back. And unlike, the Nazis, who kept very meticulous records that you can go back to in Asian art, as we heard, there's a dearth of records very frequently, but it's more recent history. So that's sort of what balances it out. My office brought an indictment against Douglas Latchford, who basically trafficked in primarily Cambodian antiquities for decades. Sharon actually was sort of the original instigation of the case as well, because they seized a piece from Sotheby's auction house called the Duryodhana, and we started investigating as part of a civil forfeiture action where that piece had come from, and Douglas Latchford's name came up, and that gave rise to basically a 7-year investigation that culminated in 2019 and has since resulted in the repatriation of about over 40 items to Cambodia and other Southeast Asian countries. But it involves basically talking to looters on the ground. There's no paperwork, and it does cause very difficult ethical questions that hang in the air right now with museums. And I don't envy the position of museum administrators, to be quite frank, because there are very difficult, you're weighing the balance between very difficult ethical really questions and not necessarily legal, because there isn't always a legal principle you can draw about what to do with these pieces. Who do you hold them in trust for? Is the idea of a universal museum even valid anymore? I mean, these are questions that people are grappling with, and there aren't easy answers. And as a prosecutor, you see all that. My job is to apply the law of the United States. So I try to keep that in mind. That is my job. I have to read the law. Does the country have clear laws? And many of these countries, some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them start, way farther back. Some of them start, more recently. And how aggressive can you get is a question with, can you go back to colonial laws? That's a big question mark. So, it's really complicated.
Tell us about your neighbor.
So I've been working on these type of cases for a long time, and my downstairs neighbor, generally knew what
Obviously,
I did.
we had talked about this before.
Right,
I didn't
right.
just say tell her, but tell us about your neighbor.
So anyway, my neighbor calls me one day. It turns out that at 6 a.m., she gets a call from the doorman downstairs who says there is a law enforcement agent in the lobby with what he claims is a warrant, and he wants to come up to your apartment. Can I send him up? So she freaks out. She comes to the door in her bathrobe. She opens it up, and her husband's in finance, and she says to the agent, "Are you here for my husband?" Her husband was so mad at her. But it turned out that that what he was there for, he was a Homeland Security agent with a seizure warrant for these 4 drawings of a temple in Lutz, Poland, the architectural drawings of this temple that were destroyed during the Holocaust. She had bought them at an auction 10 years before, had them restored. She had 4 kids. She had them, each one was going to be for each one of her children, and she had them hanging on the wall in her living room. And they were really, beautiful drawings for a beautiful temple that no longer existed. Turned out that they had been literally cut from the archive at the in the town registry. They had the archive of each one of the buildings, and from that book, someone had with a penknife cut them out perfectly. Ultimately, rolled them up, took them out of the country, and then offered them for sale. Now, this is the kind of thing where I was saying it's hard to do. There's no registry of this. How is anybody going to necessarily know that? She buys them, and who would think some historian is doing research, finds the auction catalog from 10 years ago, reaches out to the Polish government. They ultimately come to actually the U.S. Attorney's Office and, move forward and do that. So my neighbor calls me. She's like, "I know this is what you do. This can't be legal." I look at everything, I'm like, yes, it is legal. Unfortunately, you really don't have a remedy. She did get a recognition by the government of Poland that she is a wonderful person for returning it, and she was able to get her money back from the auction house. But I mean, this happens all the time.
You both have such great stories. We only have a few minutes left. I didn't know that your parents were going to be here, but if the role were reversed and you were the moderator, I would want you to serve me a big softball at the end to hit. You're proud, right? Proud parents in the second row here. Okay.
I'm from the Bay Area, so they never see me, so I invited them.
That's how. Actually, Delia is the reason we were able to get these two illustrious stars to come here and tell us of these amazing stories. But art is obviously very unique in terms of fraud and money laundering. So my softball to you is as one of the most important people who's policing these markets right now. Talk to us about why art is special.
Well, that's a harder question than you think it is.
I didn't say I was going to throw it at 10 miles an hour. It's a softball, though. I just pitched it a little bit quickly. So
yeah, listen. I go back to what I sort of said earlier, what I indicated earlier, is that I think looking at the contemporary market in particular, there are old-fashioned customs that are at play here, dealing with an unusual asset class that open up opportunities for fraud, opportunities for money laundering, and that make your job as a prosecutor pretty difficult, actually, to trace where a work came from, who owns it now, and the like. And so, I think the number of criminal cases showing money laundering in art is relatively few, despite the risk that I think everyone recognizes is out there, and that's because it is so easy to do that and do it well. And that's my view of it. I think that's the reality on the ground. When you're a prosecutor, you kind of have a sense that it's out there, and I suspect there's probably going to be a big money laundering case involving big names. I'm not previewing anything. I don't know anything.
When should we expect the indictment?
I think it's going to happen sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, that we are going to see that the things we suspected are going on are actually going on all the time. In 2020, FinCEN came out with a report on money laundering in the art market, and everyone sort of expected they would say that the art market should come under greater regulation. They didn't say that. But they did highlight a host of the risks that we've been talking about all along as being present, and I think they did a good job of analyzing that.
Last word, Sharon.
Well, I'm just going to do a shout out since Jessica's parents are here. She touched too lightly on the Douglas Latchford case. There's actually a podcast, which I thought is pretty good, Dynamite Doug, that tells the story about this. But I worked on the beginning of it and saw a little bit of this, looted Cambodian sculpture. But then Jessica, when I left the U.S. Attorney's office, took it and ran with it and brought a prosecution against this man, Douglas Latchford. What it turned out is he was the foremost expert in the world on Khmer art and wrote all the books. He was the expert for every museum. He was instrumental in the looting network. He was boots on the ground, the one that was instructing and taking the pieces out, and he was seen as untouchable. And unfortunately, he passed away before he was able to come back to the United States, but he was charged by the Southern District of New York, something that I never would have thought would have happened. And as a result of it, his family could not keep that collection. They ended up having to give it back to Cambodia. So, I just want to give a real shout out to Jessica.
That was started by you, though. It was all started by you.
But it made for a country like Cambodia that, still is struggling to come out of the time of the Khmer Rouge, makes a world of difference.
I hope that you found this as illuminating as I did. Please join me in thanking our two guests.